History has its version. I have mine. This is what truly occurred. I was young when I first witnessed Nyx walking through the realm between worlds. Not young by mortal measure, but young enough that the concept of forever still felt abstract, like trying to hold starlight in cupped hands. I served then in the household of ether, that bright upper air where gods first learned to breathe, and my duties kept me near the threshold where day met night in their eternal exchange. She arrived just as twilight softened the edges of the world. Nyx did not announce herself. She never did. One moment the path stood empty, silvered by the last traces of Hemera's retreat. The next, she was there, draped in darkness that moved like water, like breath, like something alive and aware. Her presence dimmed the sacred fire that burned at ether's gate, not through force, but through simple proximity. Light bowed to her. It always had. I stepped back from the threshold, though she had not looked my way. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the stone pillar. We who serve the bright gods learned early to recognize power, and Nyx carried it the way mountains carry weight. Inevitable and absolute. She paused at the boundary, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. The air grew cooler. Not cold exactly, but gentler, softer, like the difference between noon and dusk. Behind her, the vault of stars began their slow emergence, scattered pinpricks of heavenly gleam that followed in her wake like devoted children. From inside the hall, ether emerged. He was light itself, golden and warm, the pure radiance that existed before sun or moon. When he moved, the world seemed to clarify, edges sharpening, colors deepening. He and Nyx were opposites, or so the stories claimed, day and night, brightness and shadow. But watching them meet, I saw something different. They did not clash. They complemented. Ether reached the threshold and stopped, maintaining the boundary as Nyx maintained hers. Neither crossed into the other's domain. They stood separated by less than an arm's length, yet the space between them held the weight of cosmic law. Nyx spoke first. Her voice was not harsh or cold as I had expected. It was deep, measured, like stone settling into earth after rain. She asked about the young gods, those who had recently claimed Olympus as their seat. She wanted to know if they understood the old agreements, the boundaries that had existed since chaos first exhaled its children into being. Ether responded with diplomatic care. He spoke of Zeus and his siblings, their victory over the Titans, their division of the realms. He mentioned how they were learning to rule, finding their way through governance and power. I noticed Nyx's expression shift slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite concern. Something between patience and wariness. She had been ancient when the Titans were young, and the Olympians were younger still. Their victories meant little to her. Their defeats would mean less. She asked then about the gates, those liminal spaces where her domain touched others. Were they being respected? Were the proper offerings being made? Nyx did not demand worship, but she insisted on acknowledgement. Darkness was not optional. Night was not a courtesy. These things existed beyond petition or prayer. Ether assured her the gates remained undisturbed. No young god had yet been foolish enough to challenge the primordial rhythms. Day still yielded to night. Night still released the dawn. The cycle held because it had always held, woven into the fabric of existence itself. They spoke of other matters then, their voices dropping lower. I could not hear every word, but I caught fragments. Mentions of Erebus, her consort, who dwelt in the deepest darkness beneath the world. References to their children, numerous and powerful, each embodying some aspect of night's dominion. Sleep and death, dreams and strife, fate and doom. Nyx had birthed them all without need of union, manifesting them from her own vast nature. The conversation shifted to boundaries. Nyx wanted clarity about the new divine hierarchy. Where did Olympian authority end? What spaces remained beyond even Zeus's reach? She spoke without anger, but with absolute certainty. Some domains were hers alone. Some territories existed outside the jurisdiction of sky or sea or underworld. Ether listened carefully. He was wise enough to know that Nyx did not seek permission. She sought confirmation that limits would be respected. As they talked, I observed the way reality bent around them both. Behind Nyx, shadows pooled and deepened, forming shapes that almost became solid before dissolving again. Behind Ether, golden light trembled and danced, creating warmth without heat. They were forces made manifest, concepts given form and will. A sound drifted from the east. Hemera was returning, completing her circuit across the earth. Nyx heard it too, that subtle shift in the air that signaled her daughter's approach. She straightened slightly, preparing to yield the threshold. But before she turned away, she looked directly at me. I froze. Her eyes held depths I could not measure, darkness upon darkness folding into itself. She did not speak, but her gaze carried weight. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or warning, or simply recognition that I had witnessed this meeting, this moment when primordial night negotiated with the bright air of heaven. Then she was gone. Not walking away, not fading, simply absent, pulled back into the shadows that were her true home. The sacred fire at the gate flared brighter, as if breathing after submersion. The stars overhead dimmed slightly, no longer needing to announce her presence. Ether turned to me. His expression was calm, but I saw something in it. Respect, certainly. Maybe even a trace of old fear, the kind that predates thought itself. He told me to remember what I had seen, to mark how carefully one must step when dealing with the first children of chaos. Then he returned inside, leaving me alone at the threshold as full night settled across the world. I have served many households since then. I have witnessed countless exchanges between gods and mortals, between the powerful and the powerless. But that first meeting between Nyx and Ether remains clearest in memory. The careful distance, the mutual recognition, the understanding that some forces exist beyond conquest or control. Night was one of those forces. And Nyx was its keeper, its mother, its very essence made aware and capable of choice. The nights that followed carried a different weight. I noticed it first in small things. The way shadows lingered just slightly longer at dawn's edge. How the sacred fire sometimes flickered without wind to move it. The stars, which had always been distant and indifferent, now seemed to watch with purpose. I kept my post at the threshold, tending the flame and marking the hours between light and dark. Other servants came and went, performing their duties without awareness that anything had changed. But I had seen what they had not. I had witnessed the moment when primordial night acknowledged the new order and found it acceptable for now. Ether spoke little of the meeting. When he passed through the gate at twilight, he would pause and study the horizon where darkness gathered. His expression remained calm, but his attention carried a quality it had not held before. Watchfulness, perhaps, or simply renewed understanding of boundaries that predated his own birth. 3 nights after Nyx's visit, I observed something unusual. A young god came to the threshold just as evening descended. I recognized him by his golden sandals and the eager brightness in his eyes. Hermes, messenger of Olympus, newly appointed to his duties and still learning the protocols of divine diplomacy. He approached the gate with confidence that bordered on carelessness. His arrival scattered the gentler shadows, replacing them with quick, nervous energy. He asked for Ether, his voice carrying the assumption that doors would open and audiences would be granted simply because he requested them. I told him Ether was not present. I suggested he return during daylight hours, when such visits were customary. Hermes laughed. He said something about new rules for a new age, about how the Olympians had conquered the Titans and reshaped the cosmos according to their vision. Boundaries that had seemed fixed were now open to negotiation, he claimed. The old ways were giving ground to the new. He moved toward the threshold as if to cross it without permission. I did not stop him with words or force. I simply remained still, watching. The sacred fire dimmed suddenly, dropping to embers without cause. The air grew gentler, cooler, not threatening, but present in a way that made even swift-footed Hermes pause mid-step. Darkness gathered at the edge of perception. Not Nyx herself, I think, but her attention drawn by this small intrusion. The stars brightened overhead, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost watchful. Hermes stopped. His confidence faltered visibly. He took a step backward, then another. The golden light of his divine nature flickered like candlelight in wind. He was powerful, yes, young and blessed with Zeus's favor, but something in that moment reminded him of depths beyond his understanding. He left quickly, making excuses about messages to deliver elsewhere. The shadows returned to their usual patterns. The sacred fire rose again to its steady height. But the lesson had been taught without words, without confrontation. Some thresholds demanded respect regardless of who approached them. I reported the incident to Ether when he returned. He listened without surprise. He said the young gods would learn, as all beings must, that power had layers. Olympus ruled the middle realms now, the spaces where mortals lived and gods walked openly. But the foundations beneath and the vast darkness beyond remained under older governance. Nyx's domain was not negotiable. Night would fall whether Zeus permitted it or not. Days passed. I continued my service, watching the boundary where light met shadow. I began to notice patterns I had not seen before, the way certain birds fell silent just before full dark descended. How plants at the threshold grew differently, their leaves turning to catch both sunlight and starlight in equal measure. The boundary was not merely a location. It was a condition, a state where two fundamental forces touched without destroying each other. One evening, as I prepared the offerings for nightfall, I heard voices in the distance. Not mortal voices, but the kind that carried across greater spans than ordinary sound should travel. I recognized Hemera's tone, bright and clear as morning bells. She was speaking with someone, her words too faint to distinguish, but her manner formal, careful. I wondered if she was speaking with her mother. The two shared the threshold each day, one arriving as the other departed, maintaining the eternal rhythm that had existed since both emerged from primordial chaos. They rarely met directly, their natures too opposed to occupy the same space comfortably. But they coordinated their movements with perfect precision, neither early nor late, keeping the cycle unbroken. That night, when darkness finally settled, it seemed deeper than usual. The stars emerged in greater numbers, forming constellations I did not recognize. They moved slowly across the sky, tracing patterns that suggested meaning I could not decipher. Omens, perhaps, or simply night displaying her full complexity for those with eyes to perceive it. I thought of Nyx's children, those beings she had manifested from her own vast nature. Sleep walking soft-footed through mortal dreams. Death moving patient and inevitable toward appointed meetings, the fates measuring and cutting threads with hands that never trembled. Strife stirring trouble in places that had known peace. Each one an aspect of night's domain, each one beyond the jurisdiction of Olympus. Zeus might hurl thunderbolts and shake mountains. Poseidon might drown coastlines and shatter islands. But when darkness fell, when sleep claimed even gods, when death came calling regardless of divine protest, it was Nyx's children who held authority. I began to understand what I had witnessed at that first meeting. Not simply a negotiation between primordial forces, but a reminder. A quiet assertion that new rulers must respect what came before. The cosmos had been divided among Zeus and his siblings, yes. But some divisions had existed first, carved into reality's foundation before Olympus rose or Titans fell. Strange dreams visited me that season. I would see vast darkness spreading like water across endless plains, stars reflected in its surface. But when I looked closer, the reflections moved independently of their celestial sources. Shapes formed and dissolved in the depths, Faces almost familiar, beings almost recognizable, but never quite solid enough to name. In one dream, I stood at a crossroads where three paths met. Each led into different qualities of shadow. One held the gentle darkness of sleep, soft and welcoming. Another contained the absolute darkness of endings, final and inescapable. The third opened into darkness that held possibility, the empty space before creation begins. I woke before choosing any path. But the dream lingered, carrying a weight that felt less like imagination and more like glimpsed truth. The offerings at the threshold changed slightly after that. Someone, perhaps Ether himself, added new elements to the evening ritual. Incense that bloomed only after sunset. Wine that appeared black in firelight, but purple in full darkness. Small tokens placed at precise intervals around the sacred flame, forming patterns whose purpose I could guess but not confirm. Acknowledgement, I thought. Recognition that boundaries required maintenance, that respect demanded visible demonstration. The primordial forces did not need worship, but they insisted on proper recognition. Darkness was not merely the absence of light. Night was not simply day's remainder. These were fundamental conditions, entities in their own right, deserving of acknowledgement from any who moved through their domains. I served at that threshold for many cycles of the moon. I witnessed countless twilights, each one a small negotiation between light and shadow. And though I never again saw Nyx arrive in manifest form, I felt her presence regularly, in the cooling air, in the gathering dusk, in the stars that emerged like patient witnesses overhead. The young gods learned their lessons slowly, as youth always does. But they learned. Olympus grew in power and glory, but it grew within bounds. Some territories remained forever beyond its reach, some forces forever beyond its command. And night, primordial and eternal, continued its cycle unbroken and unbreakable, marking time according to rhythms older than memory itself. The changes to the evening ritual did not go unnoticed by other visitors to the threshold. Word traveled strangely in those days, carried perhaps by winds or starlight or the whispers of smaller spirits who moved between realms. Within a handful of seasons, others began arriving at twilight, drawn by curiosity or instruction or simple awareness that something significant transpired at this boundary. The first was one of the Muses, though I never learned which. She came as the sun touched the horizon, her robe shifting colors with each step. She carried no offerings, but she hummed softly as she approached the fire. The melody held no words, yet it seemed to speak of transitions and thresholds, of the space between one state and another. She stood watching as darkness gathered. Her humming ceased when the first stars appeared. She bowed once toward the east, then departed without speaking to me. I never saw her face clearly. The fading light made her features uncertain, as though she existed slightly outside the moment everyone else inhabited. After her came others. A river spirit whose name I did not catch, bearing water that remained liquid despite the evening chill. A lesser deity of boundaries, whose domain included doorways and crossroads. Several nymphs who tended sacred groves where shadow pooled deepest during daytime hours. They arrived separately, never in groups, each one observing the evening transition before withdrawing. None disturbed the offerings. None spoke unnecessarily. They simply witnessed, acknowledged, and departed. It felt less like pilgrimage and more like confirmation, as though they needed to see for themselves that the old rhythms held steady despite all the changes sweeping through the cosmos. Ether noticed, of course. He appeared one evening earlier than usual, while traces of blue still colored the western sky. He moved around the threshold slowly, examining the new additions to the ritual space. His fingers brushed the incense containers without opening them. He studied the placement of the small tokens, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked at me. "Who added these?" he asked. I honestly did not know. "They appear," I said. "Each evening brings something new. Small changes, never dramatic, but deliberate." He nodded slowly. "She guides them," he said. "Those who remember what came before. Those who understand that acknowledgement matters even when authority remains unquestioned." I wanted to ask more, but his attention had already shifted toward the horizon. The quality of light was changing, transforming from the warm gold of afternoon into something cooler, more complex. Colors I could not quite name flickered at the edges of perception. The air tasted different. Fresher, older. Hemira passed through moments later. She moved with her customary grace, but she paused beside the offerings. Her gaze fell upon the incense, the wine, the carefully arranged tokens. Something in her expression softened. Not quite approval, but recognition. "She sends her regards," Hemira said quietly, "to those who maintain the boundary with proper respect." Then she was gone, her light trailing after her like ribbons of silk, gradually fading as she withdrew toward whatever realm they occupied when not illuminating the world. The darkness that followed felt gentler than usual. Not warm precisely, but less austere. The stars emerged in their usual patterns, but they seemed brighter somehow, more present. I had the distinct sense of being observed, though not with hostility. Simply noticed, acknowledged in return. That night I tended the fire with extra care. I made certain the flames burned steady and clean. I arranged the evening offerings exactly as tradition prescribed, then added a small measure of the purple-black wine to the libation bowl. It felt right. Appropriate. A gesture offered without expectation of response, but with genuine respect for what the darkness represented. When sleep finally claimed me, I dreamed again. But this time the dreams held less mystery and more clarity. I walked through twilight landscapes where day and night coexisted in impossible balance. Trees bore both blossoms and fruit simultaneously. Water reflected stars overhead while also mirroring sunlight from some invisible source. In the dream, I met a woman whose face remained shadowed despite the ambient light. She did not speak, but she gestured toward the horizon where darkness gathered like a living thing. I understood somehow that she was showing me not a threat, but a foundation. The darkness was not empty space waiting to be filled. It was substance itself, rich and complete, requiring nothing additional to justify its existence. I woke before dawn with that understanding settling into my bones. The work I performed at the threshold was not merely maintenance. It was participation in something far older and more fundamental than I had initially comprehended. Each offering, each carefully tended flame, each moment of witnessing the day's departure contributed to the preservation of boundaries that held the cosmos in proper relation. The next evening, another visitor arrived. This one I recognized immediately. Morpheus, who shaped dreams and guided sleeping minds through realms of imagination and memory. He was one of Nyx's children, though he moved more freely than most. His presence at the threshold felt significant. He carried no offerings. He simply stood at the boundary between light and shadow, watching as the transition unfolded. His eyes, dark and deep as wells, reflected starlight before the stars themselves appeared. He seemed to be listening to something I could not hear, attending to rhythms that operated below the threshold of mortal perception. When full darkness finally settled, he turned to me. "You serve here faithfully," he said. His voice held the quality of whispered secrets, intimate without being intrusive. "I do what is needed," I replied. He smiled faintly. "That is more than most can claim. The boundary requires witnesses. Those who understand its importance without needing to control it." He reached into his robes and withdrew a small object. A stone, smooth and dark, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He placed it among the offerings near the fire. "From my mother," he said, "for the threshold keeper. So you remember that darkness serves as much as commands." Then he departed, dissolving into shadow so seamlessly I could not mark the moment he ceased being visible. Only his gift remained, solid and real, warm despite its appearance. I placed it in a position of honor among the other tokens, understanding without explanation that it was both blessing and responsibility. The seasons continued their progression. The ritual at the threshold evolved gradually, accumulating small additions and minor adjustments that somehow never felt random or chaotic. Each change seemed to emerge from necessity or appropriateness rather than whim. I grew older. My hair turned silver. My hands developed the calluses and scars that come from years of steady work. But the fire burned as strongly as ever, and the offerings remained constant. The threshold demanded continuity, and I provided it without complaint or expectation of reward. Through it all, night arrived with perfect regularity. Never early, never late, always precisely when the balance shifted from light to shadow. And though Nyx herself remained invisible, her presence permeated everything that transpired at that boundary. The omens began subtly. So subtly that at first I dismissed them as ordinary variations in the natural rhythm of twilight. Small disruptions, barely noticeable shifts in timing or texture that might have been nothing at all. The first occurred on a night when the moon should have been full. I watched the sky as darkness gathered, expecting the familiar silver circle to emerge above the eastern hills. But when it finally rose, it appeared diminished somehow, not obscured by clouds or dimmed by haze. Simply smaller than it should have been, as though something had taken a portion of it away. I marked the observation but said nothing. The moon had its own cycles and mysteries. Perhaps my memory had failed. Perhaps the angle of viewing had created an illusion. 3 nights later, a star fell from its position in the northern constellation. Not a shooting star, trailing fire across the heavens in momentary brilliance. This was different. One of the fixed points of light that had occupied the same location for as long as I had maintained the threshold simply ceased to exist. Between one breath and the next, it vanished. The empty space it left behind felt wrong, like a missing tooth or a word forgotten mid-sentence. The pattern of the constellation remained recognizable, but something essential had been extracted from it. I added extra offerings that night. Not because I understood what the disappearance meant, but because disruption in the established order seemed to demand acknowledgement. The fire burned lower than usual despite the careful arrangement of wood and the attention I had given to its construction. The flames produced less light, casting shorter shadows, creating smaller circles of warmth against the advancing cold. I fed it more fuel, but the diminishment persisted. When morning arrived, it came later than expected. Not by much. Perhaps the span of a dozen heartbeats. But I had witnessed the transition between night and day for so many years that even slight variations registered in my awareness like discordant notes in familiar music. Emera did not pause to speak that morning. She passed across the boundary with unusual haste, her radiance somehow muted. The quality of daylight that followed felt thinner, as though stretched across a greater distance than the world actually occupied. I worked through the day with growing unease, performing my usual tasks, but finding myself constantly glancing toward the horizon, watching for something I could not name. The animals in the surrounding countryside seemed agitated as well. Birds called at inappropriate hours. Deer moved through the forest in larger groups than normal, their eyes wide and watchful. By afternoon, clouds had gathered overhead, despite the absence of wind to drive them. They did not bring rain. They simply accumulated, layer upon layer, until the sky took on the appearance of bruised flesh. Purple and gray and something darker underneath that resisted easy description. The boundary between day and night that evening arrived precisely on schedule, but the transition felt compressed. Rushed. As though night were eager to claim its territory, or day were withdrawing more quickly than usual. I could not determine which. Darkness fell with unusual weight. Not oppressive exactly, but denser than normal. The stars that emerged seemed farther away, their light requiring more effort to reach the earth. I found myself straining to see familiar constellations, squinting against the thickness of the dark. No visitors arrived that night. The threshold remained empty except for my presence and the struggling fire. The silence felt expectant rather than peaceful, waiting for something that had not yet occurred but was already in motion. I maintained my post through the long hours, feeding the fire, speaking the traditional words, pouring libations at the appropriate intervals. The ritual provided structure when everything else seemed slightly askew. Familiar actions performed with familiar gestures, anchoring the present moment to countless similar moments that had preceded it. Near midnight, a sound drifted across the boundary. Not loud, not threatening, but distinct and undeniable. It resembled wind moving through a vast empty space, or breath drawn by something impossibly large. The sound carried no malice, but it suggested scale beyond ordinary comprehension. The fire flickered in response, though no wind touched it. The flames bent sideways, then recovered, then bent again as though pushed by an invisible hand. For a moment I thought they might extinguish entirely, but they held. Barely. When the sound faded, the night felt even heavier than before. The darkness seemed to press downward, applying gentle but insistent pressure against the earth and everything rooted to it. I could feel the weight in my chest, in my lungs, making each breath require slightly more effort than the one before. Then I noticed the shadows. They were moving independently of their sources. The shadow cast by the fire pit shifted position while the pit itself remained stationary. The shadow of a nearby tree stretched and contracted without corresponding movement in its branches. I had witnessed many unusual things during my years at the threshold, but this violation of natural law created a cold certainty in my gut. Something fundamental was changing. Some boundary that had always held was beginning to fray. The stone Morpheus had left, the one that absorbed light, began to glow faintly from within. Not bright, just a subtle luminescence that suggested contained energy seeking release. I touched it carefully and found it warm, almost hot, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. A voice emerged from the darkness then. Not speaking to me directly, but present nonetheless. It carried no words, only meaning that settled into understanding without passing through language first. What I comprehended made my hands tremble as I added more wood to the fire. The boundaries were thinning. Not breaking, not yet, but the separation between realms that had always maintained clear distinction was becoming permeable. Day and night were bleeding into each other in ways that violated their ancient covenant. The careful balance that Nyx and Hemera had maintained for uncounted ages was experiencing pressure from somewhere beyond my ability to perceive its source. And with that thinning came possibility. Not necessarily danger, but change. Profound change that would ripple through every level of existence, divine and mortal alike. I understood then why the visitors had stopped coming. They knew something was approaching. Something that demanded preparation rather than witness. The threshold would soon serve a purpose beyond simple transition. It would become a place of decision, of consequence. The night continued its slow progression toward dawn, but I did not sleep. I kept vigil beside the struggling fire, maintaining the offerings, speaking the words, preserving the ritual even as the world around me shifted in ways I could observe but not prevent. When morning finally arrived, Hemera appeared at the boundary looking diminished. Her light seemed strained, her usual radiance clouded by something I could not identify. She paused briefly, meeting my eyes with an expression that communicated both warning and sorrow. "The old ways are ending," she said quietly. "Something new is being born. We must all decide what we will become in its arrival." Then she passed westward, leaving me alone with the dying fire and the weight of omens I could not yet fully comprehend. The day that followed felt fragile. Sunlight touched the earth without conviction, casting wan illumination that failed to warm the stones around the threshold. I worked through my morning duties with hands that moved from habit rather than thought. The bread I set out for offerings remained untouched. Even the birds kept their distance. By midday, exhaustion pressed against my temples. I had not slept since the previous morning, but something kept me alert despite my body's protests. A tension in the air itself, like the moment before a thunderstorm when even insects fall silent and wait. I tried to occupy myself with mundane tasks, sweeping ash from the fire pit, arranging stones that required no arrangement, checking supplies that needed no checking. The rituals of ordinary maintenance provided comfort, though I noticed my hands shook slightly as I worked. Near afternoon, an old woman appeared on the path. She moved slowly, leaning on a staff worn smooth by decades of use. Her face carried deep lines that spoke of sun and wind and countless seasons witnessed. When she reached the threshold, she did not cross. Instead, she settled herself on a flat stone just beyond the boundary and regarded me with eyes that held no surprise. "You feel it too," she said, "not a question." I nodded, unable to find words that would adequately describe what I had observed. She unwrapped a cloth bundle and revealed black bread, dried figs, and a small clay vessel. Without ceremony, she placed these items at the edge of the threshold, then poured dark wine onto the earth. The liquid disappeared instantly, absorbed as though the ground were desperately thirsty. "My grandmother told me stories," the woman said. Her voice carried the rough texture of age, but remained clear. "About the time before time. When there was only chaos, and from chaos came the first beings. Not gods as we know them now. Something older, more fundamental." She paused, staring past me toward the western horizon where Hemera had vanished. "Nyx was among the first," she continued, "born from nothing into darkness. Not the darkness we experience each evening, the original darkness. The kind that existed before light was conceived, before day and night learned to chase each other across the sky. I had heard fragments of such stories. Every keeper of the threshold learned the basic cosmology. But this woman spoke with a certainty that suggested more than second-hand knowledge. In the beginning, she said, there were no boundaries. Chaos simply was. Undifferentiated potential. Then came separation. Earth emerged. Then Tartarus, the deep pit. Then Eros, the binding force. And with them came Nyx, darkness personified. Not evil, not good, just the absence of light given form and consciousness. The old woman shifted her weight, settling more comfortably against the stone. "My grandmother said Nyx was alone at first. Completely alone in ways we cannot imagine. The other primordial beings existed, but they were consumed with their own natures. Gaia with earth, Tartarus with depth, Eros with connection. Nyx had only darkness, only shadow, only the eternal night that knew no dawn, because dawn had not yet been imagined." A crow landed nearby, cocking its head to observe us. The woman glanced at it but did not pause her narrative. "From Nyx came Erebus," she said, "the darkness of the underworld. Born from her without union, emerging as a companion who matched her nature. Together they were the original night, the first darkness. And from their union came Ether and Hemera, light and day, the first opposites born from sameness." I considered this. The idea that day was born from night. That light emerged from darkness rather than the reverse. It contradicted everything intuition suggested, yet something in it felt true. "Hemera grew into her power," the woman continued, "and discovered she could not coexist with her mother. Where day walked, night retreated. Where night gathered, day withdrew. So they made an agreement, an ancient covenant. They would share the world but never occupy it simultaneously. When one arrived, the other would depart. An eternal dance of approach and withdrawal." The crow took flight, its shadow passing briefly across the threshold. "For ages beyond counting, this pattern held," the old woman said. "Perfect balance. But my grandmother warned that all patterns eventually face disruption, that boundaries grown too rigid become brittle, that what separates must sometimes merge to prevent shattering. She stood slowly, joints protesting the movement. Her eyes met mine with an intensity that made me straighten, despite my fatigue. "You keep watch at the meeting place," she said, "where day and night touch without mixing, where the covenant is renewed each dawn and dusk. You will witness what comes next. Perhaps you will understand it better than I could." "What is coming?" I asked. The woman smiled, but the expression carried no joy, only recognition of something inevitable. "Return," she said simply. "Nyx is remembering herself, remembering what she was before boundaries were necessary, before the world required the separation of day from night. The old powers do not age, but they can sleep. And when they wake, they remember their original nature." She turned to leave, then paused. "My grandmother left something for the keepers of this threshold," she said. "Instructions for what to do when the boundaries blur. I never understood them until now. She said when shadows move without light and light dims without clouds, prepare 3 offerings. Blood for the earth, milk for the sky, wine for the waters between. Place them at the threshold when the sun neither rises nor sets, when the moment exists outside of moments." "When would that be?" I asked. "You will know," she replied. "The world will tell you." She walked back down the path, staff tapping rhythmically against stone. I watched until she disappeared around the bend, then turned my attention to the offering she had left, the bread, the figs, the empty vessel that still smelled of wine. The afternoon stretched longer than it should have. Shadows refused to move at their proper pace. I measured their progress against marks I had made on stones, checking and rechecking my observations. Something was interfering with time itself, stretching moments like wax held over flame. When evening finally approached, I prepared for Hemera's passage with more care than usual. Fresh wood for the fire, new oil for the lamps. Words spoken slowly and precisely, giving each syllable its full weight. But Hemera did not come. I waited as darkness gathered. The fire burned steady now, its flames accepting the fuel without resistance. Stars emerged overhead, closer than they had been the previous night. The air grew cool, then cold, then stopped changing temperature as though it had reached some final state and could drop no further. Still no Hemera. Night filled the world completely. Absolute and total. The kind of darkness that suggested nothing existed beyond arm's reach. I fed the fire and watched its light struggle against the pressing dark. Somewhere in that blackness I sensed presence, not threatening, simply there, vast and patient and aware. The original night, perhaps. The darkness that had existed before opposites were necessary, before day needed to be distinguished from its absence. I touched the stone Morpheus had left. It pulsed warm against my palm. Its faint glow seemed brighter now against the surrounding dark, though its light illuminated nothing beyond its own surface. The boundaries were not just thinning, they were dissolving. And somewhere in that dissolution, Nyx was emerging from ages of enforced separation, remembering what she had been in the beginning, before dawn was born from her body. Before she learned to retreat at her daughter's approach, before the world required anything but darkness and the dreams that moved within it. I sat by the fire through hours that felt suspended outside the normal flow of time. The flames cast no shadows on the ground. The light ended abruptly where darkness pressed against it, creating no gradient of diminishing illumination. Just fire, then absolute black. The stone in my hand continued its steady pulse. Warm, but not hot. Rhythmic, but not quite matching my heartbeat. I wondered if it measured some other tempo. The breathing of night itself, perhaps. I thought about what the old woman had said. That Nyx was remembering. That the ancient powers could sleep, but never truly changed. That boundaries grown rigid became brittle. The fire needed tending. I added wood from my dwindling supply and watched the new pieces catch. The flames accepted them without the usual crackling protest. Everything seemed quieter now. as though the darkness absorbed sound along with light. My mind drifted to Hemera. Where was she? Had she chosen not to come, or had something prevented her passage? The covenant between mother and daughter had held for ages beyond counting, an eternal pattern of retreat and return. But tonight the pattern had broken, or perhaps not broken. Perhaps simply paused. I tried to imagine what it meant for Nyx to remember herself, to recall existence before separation became necessary, before the world required day and night to take turns rather than coexist. What had she been in that first darkness? What had the world been? The old woman's grandmother had spoken of it, chaos first. Then Nyx emerging from that void, darkness given form. Not evil or good, simply there. Complete in itself. I wondered if completeness was what Nyx remembered. The wholeness of being the only darkness, of filling everything without needing to withdraw or accommodate or share. The stone's pulse seemed to deepen. I held it closer, studying its faint glow. It illuminated my palm and nothing else, a small pocket of light that refused to spread. Something moved in the darkness beyond the fire. Not a shape exactly, more like the suggestion of movement, a shifting of density. A place where the black seemed somehow thicker. I stayed still. The fire crackled softly. The stone pulsed. The presence drew closer. I felt it the way one feels winter approaching before the first snow falls. An inevitability, a change in the quality of existence itself. I thought about fear then, whether I should feel it, whether terror was appropriate in the face of such vastness. But what rose in me was something different. Not calm exactly, more like acceptance. Like understanding that some things exist beyond human emotion, beyond the categories we use to make sense of the world. The stone grew warmer, not uncomfortably so, just enough to notice. I spoke into the darkness. Not loudly, not with ceremony or ritual words. Just simple acknowledgement. "I see you," I said. The night pressed closer still. The fire dimmed slightly, not dying, but receding, giving ground. I waited. The stone pulsed in my palm. The fire breathed. The stars overhead, impossibly close, watched with ancient patience. Minutes passed. Or hours. Time had lost its usual meaning. Then, gradually, a change. The pressure of the darkness eased slightly. Not retreating, just relaxing, as though tension had been held and now released. The stone's pulse slowed. Its warmth remained constant, but the urgency faded. The fire brightened a fraction, reclaiming a small portion of its usual sphere of influence. I exhaled slowly. Realized I had been holding my breath without knowing when I had drawn it in. The presence remained. I could still sense it. But something had shifted. Some recognition had passed between Threshold Keeper and ancient power. Some acknowledgement that required no words. I thought again about the offerings the old woman had described. Blood for the earth, milk for the sky, wine for the waters between, to be given when the sun neither rose nor set, when the moment existed outside of moments. Was this that time? This suspended night where Hemera had not come, and hours stretched without progression. I looked at the threshold, the stone marking the boundary between what approached and what departed, between the covenant of mother and daughter, between day and night. The offerings should be placed there, at that exact point where separation occurred, where the ancient agreement renewed itself twice daily. But I had no blood to give, no milk. The wine had already soaked into thirsty ground earlier that day. The stone in my hand pulsed once, firmly. Then stilled completely. I understood. The offerings were not literal, or not entirely. Blood for the earth meant life acknowledged, mortality recognized. The understanding that what walks in flesh must eventually return to soil. Milk for the sky meant nourishment flowing upward. Gratitude given to what provides. Recognition that we drink from sources we cannot see. Wine for the waters between meant transformation. The change that occurs between states. The fermentation of grape to something more. The mixing of what separated becomes something new. I stood slowly. My legs protested. I had sat longer than I realized. The fire had burned lower than I remembered feeding it. I walked to the threshold. The darkness pressed close, but did not hinder my movement. The stone marking the boundary looked no different than usual, just a shaped rock indicating a specific point on ground that otherwise seemed ordinary. I knelt there, placed both palms flat against earth still marked by the dark wine that had soaked in earlier. The stone from Morpheus. I sat carefully at the threshold's exact center, then I spoke. Not ritual words, not prayers learned or ceremonies rehearsed, just truth witnessed. I am here, I said. I keep watch at the meeting place. I acknowledge what approaches. I do not understand it fully, but I witness it. I offer attention. Presence. Recognition that boundaries serve their purpose, but cannot hold forever. That what separates must sometimes remember its original unity. The darkness seemed to listen. The fire behind me burned steady. I remained kneeling. Minutes passed. The stone at the threshold center began to glow more brightly. Its light spread outward slightly, illuminating a small circle of ground. In that circle, I saw them. The offerings the old woman had left, the bread, gas, the empty vessel. They remained untouched. Birds had not eaten the bread. Wind had not scattered the figs. The vessel sat exactly where it had been placed. But they looked different now, less solid, as though they existed between states, neither fully present nor fully absent. I understood then. The offerings were never meant to be consumed. They were meant to be witnessed, to mark intention, to demonstrate recognition that some debts require acknowledgement rather than payment. The glow from the stone faded. The darkness settled back to its absolute depth. The presence I had sensed drew back, not withdrawing, but simply becoming less immediate. I returned to my fire, added more wood, settled back into position. The night continued, deep and complete, but no longer pressing, no longer urgent with remembering. Nyx had returned to herself briefly, had touched the world with her original nature, had remembered what she had been before boundaries became necessary. And now she rested, patient again, willing to wait for what would come next. I sat through the remaining hours of darkness. The stone from Morpheus remained at the threshold. The fire burned steady. The stars watched from their impossible closeness. When dawn finally came, it came slowly, tentatively, as though Hemera approached with new caution, with awareness that something had changed during her absence. I watched the first gray seep into eastern sky, watched darkness yield by degrees rather than swift departure. The covenant held, but it held differently now, with new understanding woven into ancient pattern. Gray light spread across the horizon like ink dropped into water. Slow, deliberate, without the usual rush of morning. I watched it move and wondered if Hemera had forgotten how to arrive, or if she had remembered something she had long chosen to ignore. The fire beside me had burned to coals. I had not fed it in some time. Its warmth still reached me, but the flames had settled into embers that glowed without movement. The stone at the threshold no longer pulsed. It sat dark and ordinary against the earth, but the world had changed. I felt it in the way the air moved, in the quality of light that came with dawn. Something had shifted during those suspended hours. Some agreement had been altered. I stood. My joints protested. I walked to the threshold and retrieved the stone. It felt cool now. Just a river stone worn smooth by water and time. I slipped it into my pocket. The offerings remained where they had been placed. Bread. Figs. Empty vessel. Still untouched. Still existing in that strange state between presence and absence. I left them there. They belonged to the threshold now, to whatever understanding had been reached in darkness. The path back to the village appeared before me as light grew stronger. I had walked it many times, but this morning it looked different. The stones seemed arranged with greater purpose. The trees leaned toward each other as though sharing secrets. Even the dust held patterns I had not noticed before. I walked slowly. There was no need for haste. Time had resumed its normal flow, but something about the night's suspension made rushing feel improper. Disrespectful to what had occurred. The village appeared as the sun finally cleared the horizon. Properly cleared it, no longer tentative. Hemera had remembered her role, but she had brought something new with her. Some quality of light that acknowledged what darkness held. The streets were empty. Too early yet for most, but smoke rose from one chimney. The baker's house, always the first to wake. I could smell bread even from this distance. I passed the well where the old woman had spoken. The bucket still hung from its rope. Water reflected sky. Nothing marked the place as special, yet I paused there, placed one hand against the stone wall surrounding the well's mouth, cool beneath my palm. Solid. Real in the way things are real when morning comes and confirms their existence. I thought about the old woman's words, about the covenant that required witnesses, about boundaries that must be maintained but cannot hold forever. What had changed during that suspended night? What had Nyx remembered about herself that altered her agreement with her daughter? I did not know. Could not know. I was only the witness. The one who kept watch at the meeting place. Who acknowledged what approached even without understanding it fully. But I sensed this much. The separation between night and day had been absolute since the world began. Nyx withdrew when Hemera advanced. Hemera departed when Nyx returned. They maintained their distance. Never meeting, never touching. Last night had broken that pattern. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough to show that separation was choice rather than necessity. That boundaries existed because they served a purpose, not because they could not be crossed. The implications spread outward from that realization. If night and day could remember their shared origin, what else might remember? What other separations might prove less absolute than believed? I continued walking, past the baker's house. The smell of bread grew stronger, yeast and grain and heat combining into something that sustained life. Simple transformation performed daily, ordinary miracle repeated without ceremony. The door opened as I passed. The baker emerged, flour dusting his arms. He nodded to me, said nothing. Returned inside. I had been seen. Acknowledged. The night's vigil had ended. I was back in the world of transactions and conversations, of bread that must be baked and water that must be drawn. But I carried something back with me, knowledge gained through witnessing, understanding earned through presence rather than study. My house stood where I had left it. Small, unremarkable. Walls of stone and roof of thatch, a door that hung slightly crooked, a window that let in drafts. I entered. The interior felt strange after the night spent in absolute darkness. Familiar objects seemed subtly altered. The table, the chair, the shelf holding 3 cups and a pitcher. I sat at the table, placed both palms flat against its surface, wood worn smooth by years of use. Solid, present, real. But I could still feel the threshold beneath my hands, could still sense the darkness that had pressed close, the presence that had acknowledged recognition without words. The stone from Morpheus sat in my pocket. I drew it out, placed it on the table before me. It looked like nothing special, just a river stone. Thousands like it existed. Millions, perhaps, shaped by water, smoothed by time, ordinary in every way. Yet it had carried messages from the god of dreams, had pulsed with rhythm that connected waking to sleeping, had glowed at the threshold when offerings were witnessed rather than consumed. I picked it up, held it to the light coming through the window. The sun had fully risen now. Day had arrived properly. The world resumed its usual patterns. Cocks crowed, goats bleated. Children's voices rose from distant houses. But something remained different. Some quality of light that held memory of deeper darkness. Some awareness that separation served its purpose but could not hold forever. I thought about the covenant, about Nyx and Hemera meeting twice daily at threshold, about the exchange that happened in moments too brief for mortal eyes to catch. What did they say to each other in those instants? What passed between mother and daughter when the world stood balanced between their respective domains? I would never know. Some things existed beyond witness, beyond presence and attention and acknowledgement. But I had seen enough, had kept watch through the night when Hemera failed to arrive, had witnessed Nyx remembering what she had been before boundaries became necessary. That was sufficient. That was the role I had been given, not to understand fully, not to explain or interpret, simply to be present, to acknowledge, to witness without demanding answers. I stood, moved to the shelf, poured water from the pitcher into one of the cups, drank slowly. Cold, clean, ordinary. Yet after the suspended night, even water tasted different. More itself somehow, more completely what it was meant to be. I finished the water, set the cup down, placed the stone beside it. Outside, the day continued its normal progression. Sun climbed higher, heat increased. Shadows shortened as morning advanced toward noon, but I knew now what those shadows held. What darkness waited patiently for its turn. What ancient power rested between moments, patient and absolute, willing to wait for what would come next. The covenant had been altered, not broken, not ended, but changed in some fundamental way. And I had witnessed it, had been present at the threshold when understanding passed between powers older than words. That would be enough, would have to be enough. I left the house, returned to the ordinary world of bread and water and conversations, of tasks that must be completed and obligations that must be met. But I carried the stone with me, kept it close, a reminder that boundaries serve their purpose, that separation exists for reason, but also that what divides must sometimes remember its original unity. That night and day share a source deeper than their endless exchange, that even the most ancient patterns can shift when witnessed truly. The afternoon arrived without ceremony. Heat settled over the village like a hand pressed flat against skin. Dust hung motionless in the air where children had played earlier. Now they sheltered indoors, waiting for evening's relief. I walked to the edge of the settlement. Beyond the last house, fields stretched toward distant hills. Wheat ripened in silence. Nothing moved except heat shimmer rising from the earth. The stone remained in my pocket. Its weight felt constant. Not heavy, simply present. A thing carried without effort, acknowledged without thought. I found myself wondering about other thresholds, other places where boundaries met and held, where one thing became another through patient exchange rather than violent transformation. The river marked such a place. Water meeting land, neither consuming the other, simply defining where each domain ended. I walked there now, followed the path worn smooth by feet and hooves and cartwheels. The same path generations had walked, would walk after I was gone. The river ran low this time of year. Midsummer drought had drawn down its depth, exposed stones that normally rested beneath the current. Green moss clung to them, dark and wet despite the heat. I sat on the bank, removed my sandals, let my feet rest in water that moved with steady purpose toward the sea, cold against sun-warmed skin. The contrast, sharp but not unpleasant, two qualities existing simultaneously, neither negating the other. Upstream, a heron stood motionless in the shallows, long legs planted, head angled downward, watching the water with patience older than thought. I had seen that bird before, many times, always in the same spot, always holding the same posture of absolute attention. Did it remember each fish it caught? Each day it had stood watching? Or did time move differently for creatures who live by instinct rather than memory? The heron struck suddenly, head darting forward, beak breaking the surface. When it withdrew, a small fish struggled in its grasp. The bird swallowed, returned to stillness, resumed its vigil. Life fed on life. Water flowed to the sea, patterns repeated because they worked, because they sustained what needed sustaining. I thought about Nyx in those terms. Not as a goddess who commanded worship or demanded sacrifice, but as a pattern that sustained existence. Darkness arriving when light grew exhausted, rest following labor, silence after noise. The covenant she maintained with Hemera served that purpose, created rhythm that allowed both to exist, neither eternal, neither absent, both necessary. What would happen if that rhythm broke completely? If night decided to remain when day should arrive? Or if day refused to yield when darkness gathered? The world would not survive such disruption. Crops would fail, animals would sicken. Even the gods, I suspected, needed the exchange to continue, needed the balance that separated without destroying. The heron lifted from the water, wings spread wide. It flew downstream, following the current toward evening's hunting grounds. I remained sitting. Let the water move past my feet, felt its coolness rise through skin and bone. A fish surfaced briefly, scales catching sunlight. Then it dove, leaving only ripples that spread outward and faded. Everything returned to its source eventually. Water to the sea, heat to the sun, darkness to whatever place it gathered between cycles. And witnesses returned to ordinary life, to houses with crooked doors and drafty windows, to cups that held water and tables that bore weight. But something persisted, some quality of awareness that remained after witnessing ended. I understood now why the old woman had spoken of Nyx with such careful respect, why offerings were left at the threshold rather than brought to temples, why prayers whispered at dusk were answered in dreams rather than visions. Nyx did not demand attention, did not require elaborate ritual or public ceremony. She simply arrived each evening, claimed her portion of time, departed when her daughter's turn came. The constancy itself was the miracle, the reliability, the patient exchange that had continued since the first separation of darkness from chaos. I drew the stone from my pocket again, held it in my palm, let water drip across its surface. The river smoothed stones over centuries, water and time combining into transformation so slow it seemed like stillness. Yet eventually every edge rounded, every sharp surface wore away. Was that what happened to ancient powers? Did time smooth them somehow? Make them less harsh, less absolute, less dangerous? Or did they remain unchanged while mortals simply learned to live alongside them, learned which boundaries could be approached and which must be respected from distance? The sun began its descent toward evening. Shadows lengthened across the fields. The wheat caught golden light and held it briefly. Soon darkness would arrive. Nyx would resume her watch. The covenant would continue. But she would remember, would carry awareness of what she had been before separation became necessary, before boundaries were drawn and maintained. And somewhere, in whatever place she rested between cycles, perhaps she thought about that suspended night, about the mortal who had kept vigil at the threshold, who had witnessed without demanding explanation or reward. I stood, brushed dust from my clothing, put my sandals back on. The walk home felt shorter than the walk out. Distance contracted when familiar, when each stone and tree held recognition. My house waited, small against the landscape, insignificant in the greater pattern of field and sky and distant mountains. Yet it was mine, a place to shelter, a threshold to cross between outside and inside, between the world of witness and the world of rest. I entered. The interior had cooled slightly, stone walls holding memory of morning's chill despite the afternoon heat. The cup still sat on the table, the stone beside it, exactly where I had left them. I picked up the stone once more, turned it slowly, let light from the window illuminate its surface. Nothing special, nothing that would draw notice if seen lying on a riverbank or beside a path. But it carried meaning now, had become more than simple stone through what it had witnessed, through the role it had played in messages passed between dreaming and waking. I wrapped it in a scrap of linen, placed it on the shelf beside the cups, not hidden, simply stored, available when needed, otherwise allowed to rest. The evening would arrive soon, then night, then morning again. The pattern would continue, would hold, and I would resume my ordinary life, would bake bread or mend walls or draw water from the well. But I would remember what I had seen, what darkness contained when it remembered its wholeness, what boundaries served and what they could not prevent. That knowledge felt sufficient, felt like exactly what was meant to be carried forward. Nothing more was required. Nothing less would be enough. The bread needed baking. I had promised myself that when I returned from the river, ordinary tasks to anchor the strange knowledge I now carried. I measured flour into the wide clay bowl, added salt, poured water from the pitcher and began to knead. The dough resisted at first, then softened under pressure. My hands remembered the rhythm without thought. Outside, the light continued its slow descent toward evening. The wheat fields held their golden color. Soon they would fade to bronze, then shadow. Nyx had children beyond Hemera. The old woman had mentioned them only briefly, names spoken quickly as though their enumeration itself held risk. Thanatos, Hypnos, the Fates, others whose functions I could only guess at. I had never considered what it meant that death was the child of night, that sleep shared the same mother, that the threads measuring mortal life were spun by daughters of darkness. The dough grew smooth, elastic. I formed it into a round loaf and placed it in the shallow pan. When Nyx emerged from chaos, she had not been alone in the void. Other primordial beings had existed. Erebus, Tartarus, Gaia herself, though she came after or perhaps during. Time had no clear sequence in those first moments. But Nyx had been first among the darkness, had claimed that realm entirely, made it hers through simple presence rather than conquest. The fire in the hearth had burned low. I added wood, waited for flames to catch and grow. Heat spread slowly through the room. Erebus had been her consort. The darkness of the underworld paired with the darkness of the upper world. Together they had produced their own opposites, ether and Hemera, light and day born from shadow. I wondered if that had been intentional, a choice to create balance, or simply what emerged when primordial forces combined. The flames steadied. I placed the pan near the heat, not too close. Bread required patience. The stories mortals told rarely mentioned Nyx directly. She appeared at the edges of other tales, present but not central, acknowledged but not examined. Zeus himself was said to fear her. The king of Olympus, who commanded thunder and ruled the gods, would not challenge the ancient power of night, I had heard that story from a traveling bard. How Hypnos, god of sleep, had once angered Zeus, how he fled to his mother's realm, and how Zeus, pursuing him with rage and lightning ready, stopped at the threshold of Nyx's domain, would not enter, turned back rather than risk her displeasure. The bard had told it as comedy. The mighty Zeus forced to retreat. The audience had laughed. But sitting now in my small house while evening approached, I understood it differently. Zeus had not retreated from fear of violence or power. He had recognized something older than himself, something that preceded even his father and grandfather. Boundaries that must be respected. The bread began to bake. A familiar smell filled the room, yeast and grain. Nyx's children served functions that gods could not refuse. Every mortal needed sleep. Every mortal faced death. Every mortal's life followed threads already measured and cut. These were not punishments, not rewards, simply conditions of existence itself. The gods might grant immortality, might delay death, might bless certain mortals with favor or curse others with suffering. But they could not eliminate the functions Nyx's children served, could not remake the world without darkness, sleep, or measured fate. I turned the bread. Let the other side face the heat. Mortals built temples to Zeus and Athena, to Apollo and Artemis, to Demeter and Dionysus. Gods who walked among humans in stories, who answered prayers and demanded sacrifice. But Nyx received simpler offerings. A cup of wine left at the doorstep, a whispered word at dusk, acknowledgement rather than supplication, perhaps because she had never asked for more, had never demanded worship or built a cult of followers. She arrived each evening regardless, left each morning without fail. Her presence was its own prayer, her absence each dawn its own blessing. The bread finished baking. I removed it from the heat, set it on the table to cool. Through the window, the sun touched the horizon. The wheat fields darkened. Birds settled in the trees for night. Soon the first stars would appear. Not yet, but soon. I poured water into my cup, drank slowly. The water tasted of stone and earth, of the river that flowed past the village toward distant seas. Everything in the world had origin, even the gods, even the primordial powers that shaped chaos into order. But some origins remained obscure. Nyx had no mother, no father, no tale of birth or emergence. She simply was, had always been, would continue being long after temples crumbled and gods faded from memory. Darkness required no maintenance, no sacrifice to continue existing, no belief to remain real. I broke a piece from the bread. Still warm. The crust crackled softly. The old woman had known this, had understood that witness mattered more than worship. That knowledge held more value than petition. She had seen me as someone who might comprehend what she had spent a lifetime learning. The careful respect, the measured distance, the recognition of power that needed no acknowledgement but deserved it nonetheless. I ate slowly. Let the bread satisfy hunger that went deeper than appetite. Outside, the last sunlight faded. The threshold between day and night narrowed to nothing, then crossed. Nyx arrived without announcement. Darkness spread across the fields, filled the spaces between houses, claimed the paths and gardens and distant mountains. I did not light a lamp, sat instead in the growing dark. Let my eyes adjust. Let the familiar room take on its nighttime shapes. The cup on the table, the shelf with its wrapped stone, the hearth with dying embers casting faint red light, all visible still, all present. Night did not erase, did not destroy. It simply changed what could be seen and how, drew attention to different details, made the ordinary mysterious again. This was Nyx's gift, though she would never name it as such. The transformation of the known into the strange, the daily into the eternal. Every sunset was the same sunset, every darkness the same darkness, yet each night felt singular, held its own quality, its own particular silence. I finished the bread, drank the last of my water. Tomorrow I would draw more from the well, would mend the wall where stones had shifted, would walk to the market if supplies were needed. Ordinary tasks, mortal concerns. But tonight I sat in darkness with new understanding, with knowledge that changed nothing and everything at once. Nyx continued her journey across the sky. Her daughter rested in whatever place she waited. The rhythm held. And I, a witness who had kept vigil, carried forward what I had seen, what I had learned, what I would remember when darkness arrived each evening for the rest of my numbered days. That seemed enough. More than enough. The fire died completely. The room grew cool. Outside, night deepened toward the hours when even the vigilant began to sleep. I rose, prepared for rest. Tomorrow would bring its own light, its own tasks, its own small portion of life's measured thread. For now, darkness sheltered. White held watch. The covenant continued. And I, grateful for knowledge that asked nothing in return, let sleep find me where I waited. I woke before dawn. The room held that particular stillness that precedes first light. No birds yet, no distant voices, just the quiet breath of a world waiting. The embers had died completely. Cold air pressed against my face where I lay. I pulled the blanket closer, remained still. Sleep had come easily after the bread and darkness. No dreams disturbed it, or if they did, I carried no memory of them forward into waking. This was the hour Nyx began her departure. Not sudden. Why? Not announced. But gradual. A slow withdrawal as her opposite prepared to cross the threshold she had vacated. I listened for her leaving. Heard nothing, felt nothing. Yet something shifted in the quality of darkness. A loosening. A preparation for absence. The old woman had spoken once of this hour, the liminal time between full night and approaching dawn. She called it the resting place. The moment when darkness paused before retreating, when light gathered itself before advancing. Neither ruled completely. Both held equal claim to the edges of sky. I rose, wrapped the blanket around my shoulders against the cold, moved to the window without lighting lamp or candle. Outside, stars still marked their positions. Familiar constellations held their eternal arrangements. The wheat fields remained invisible beneath shadow that had not yet begun to thin. But the eastern horizon carried the faintest suggestion of change. Not light. Not yet. Just the promise of it. The knowledge that somewhere beyond the curve of world, Hemira prepared her chariot. Nyx would meet her there. Would pass whatever silent greeting primordial sisters exchanged. Would retreat to whatever realm housed her during bright hours. I had wondered about that place, where darkness went when light arrived. What space could contain something so vast, so fundamental? Perhaps it was not a place at all. Perhaps Nyx simply ceased being visible while remaining present. A background against which light performed its daily drama. The way a canvas holds paint. The way silence frames sound. I left the window. Found the water pitcher by touch. Poured what remained into my cup. Drank standing. The water tasted different in darkness. Colder, more itself somehow. As though night returned things to their essential nature before daylight complicated them with visibility and use. I set the cup down. Felt along the shelf until my fingers found the wrapped stone. Still carrying whatever weight the old woman had given it through her years of careful witness, I had not unwrapped it since taking it from her house. Had not needed to. Its presence sufficed. A reminder of attention paid. of knowledge earned through patience rather than demanded through prayer. The stone rested cool against my palm through the fabric, smooth and dense. Older than any god, older than the first dawn that broke across fresh earth. It had seen Nyx when she was new, when chaos first organized itself into darkness and the concept of night emerged from undifferentiated void. Though seen was not the word. The stone had no eyes, no awareness, yet it had been present, had witnessed through simple existence, through being there when there began. I returned it to its place on the shelf, let my hand fall away. Behind me, the faintest gray touched the eastern sky, barely perceptible. Just the first suggestion that night was considering departure. I moved to the hearth, knelt beside yesterday's ashes, arranged kindling, found the flint and struck it, once, twice, 3 times before a spark caught and held. The flame grew slowly, fed on dry grass and small twigs, cast moving shadows across familiar walls. Light returned to the room in careful increments. Shapes emerged, table, bench. The clay bowl still dusted with flour from yesterday's bread. Outside, the transformation continued. Stars began their fade. Not gone, simply overwhelmed by something brighter approaching. I added larger wood to the fire, let it catch and spread. Heat reached my hands, my face, pushed back the cold that had gathered during night's deepest hours. This was the rhythm. Fire in the morning, bread in the afternoon, darkness in the evening, sleep when night deepened toward its center. Mortal time divided into portions, measured by needs and tasks and the body's small rebellions against discomfort. But underneath, the greater rhythm continued. Nyx and Hemera trading places, darkness and light taking turns. The covenant older than Zeus's throne, older than Olympus itself. I stood, stretched, felt the familiar ache in shoulders and back that came with age and work. Mortal complaints, brief inconveniences in a life that would itself prove brief when measured against immortal spans. Yet not worthless, not meaningless. The old woman had lived to see perhaps 70 summers, maybe more. She had witnessed Nyx arrive 25,000 times, had watched the sun set, had seen stars appear in their appointed places, had marked the moon's changes through all its phases and cycles. That seemed like wealth of a kind temples could not purchase, like knowledge prayers could not extract from reluctant gods. I poured more water, drank again. The light continued growing. Soft gray became pale gold. The wheat fields emerged from shadow. Individual stalks became visible where before only darkness had pooled. A bird called, then another. The morning chorus beginning its daily declaration that night had passed. That light held temporary dominion once more. I went to the door, opened it carefully. The air outside carried dawn's particular crispness. Cool, but not cold. Fresh without wind. The village remained quiet. A few early risers moved between houses. Smoke began rising from hearths as others woke and started fires like mine. Ordinary morning, ordinary day beginning. But I carried forward what darkness had taught, what the old woman had preserved. What Nyx demonstrated through simple constancy rather than demand. Power did not require recognition to remain powerful. Truth did not need belief to stay true. The fundamental conditions of existence continued regardless of mortal understanding or divine approval. Night would return. Sleep would claim even the vigilant. Death would arrive when the thread reached its measured end. These were not threats, not punishments, simply facts. The structure upon which everything else built itself. I stood in the doorway watching light claim what darkness had released. Neither fought, neither resisted. They simply exchanged places as they had always done, as they would continue doing long after I became memory, then story, then less than story. Eventually, I would return to Earth, become part of the ground that grew wheat, that held water in deep wells, that supported houses and roads and the careful gardens where mortals grew food and flowers. The stone would remain longer, would outlast the house, the village, perhaps even the mountains themselves given sufficient time. But it would keep no record, hold no memory. Simply continue being stone, being present, being witness in the only way stone could manage. That seemed like its own kind of prayer, its own devotion. I closed the door, returned to the fire. The morning tasks waited. Water to draw, bread to plan, small repairs to consider, life continuing in its measured portions. The night had taught me nothing I could name, nothing I could carry to the market in exchange for grain or olive oil. But something had shifted nonetheless, some understanding that went deeper than words, that resided in the body's knowledge rather than the mind's careful cataloguing. Nyx had passed, would return. The rhythm held, and I, having watched and waited and learned what witness meant, moved forward into light with darkness remembered, with night honored through attention rather than supplication. That would be enough, more than enough. The fire burned steady. The day began. The wheel turned as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere beyond sight, beyond knowing, night rested in whatever realm housed her during brightness, preparing for evening's return, for darkness's next arrival, patient, eternal, unbothered by gods or mortals, or time's slow erosion of all things except the fundamental conditions that made existence possible. I tended the fire. Let heat fill the room. Let morning claim its hours. Tomorrow would bring its own darkness, its own lessons, its own quiet demonstrations of what endured when everything else faded. For now, light sufficed. Work waited. The day spread before me with its small tasks and smaller satisfactions. I began them without ceremony, without prayer. Simply moved forward into what remained of my numbered portion. That was witness enough. The neighbor arrived mid-morning. Her knock came soft against the doorframe, respectful of the threshold between dwellings. I recognized the pattern. 3 taps, pause, 1 more. I opened the door. She stood with a basket covered in cloth. Her face carried the particular tiredness mothers wore when children fought sleep through the night. "We have extra bread," she said. Still warm. Her eyes moved past me to the empty table. The hearth with its modest fire. The room's spare furnishings that spoke clearly about what I possessed and what I lacked. I hesitated. Pride suggested refusal. Stomach suggested acceptance. She placed the basket in my hands before I chose. The warmth of baked grain radiated through the woven reeds. "My daughter would not settle," she said. Kept asking about the dark, whether it would stay, whether morning would forget to arrive. I lifted the cloth. 2 small loaves rested inside, their crusts golden, their scent filling the space between us.
"What did you tell her?"
I asked. That night always leaves. That her grandmother promised this. That promises older than temples do not break. She smiled, tired but genuine. The expression of someone who had found words that worked even if understanding remained incomplete. "I told her your neighbor knows about such things," she added. "That you watch and remember." She wanted to come with me, to ask you directly. The girl could not have been more than 5 summers, maybe 6, already learning that some questions required specific people to answer them. "Another time," I said, "when she needs to hear it herself rather than through someone else's telling." The neighbor nodded, adjusted the empty basket on her arm. The morning light caught the gray threading through her dark hair, time marking its passage through small changes. through incremental shifts that accumulated until one day the mirror showed someone different than memory held. "The old woman used to bring my mother bread," she said, "when we first moved to the village, when we knew no one and everything felt strange." She paused, looked toward the eastern window where light now filled the frame completely. "My mother said the old woman never explained why, never asked for anything back, just appeared sometimes with food or wood or oil for lamps, like she knew before we did what we would need." I had not known this. The old woman had kept her own counsel, had moved through the village quietly, had helped without announcement or record. "She told my mother once that Nix taught her this," the neighbor continued, "that darkness gave without asking. That night covered everyone equally. That some things should be offered freely because the world was already difficult enough. The word settled between us. Truth spoken plainly. No decoration required. My daughter is learning to count," the neighbor said. "We practice by numbering things around the house. Cups, stones, the beams in the ceiling. She counts the stars now, too. Every clear evening she stands outside and points upward. Tries to keep track of which lights appeared first, which ones cluster together, which stand alone." "I do not know their names," she admitted. Cannot tell her the stories priests tell in temples, but she counts them anyway. Makes her own patterns, sees her own shapes. That seems sufficient, perhaps better than sufficient. Children learned what mattered by watching what adults attended to. The neighbor counted practical things, cups and beams and resources that sustained living. But she allowed her daughter to count stars, to number things without use or purpose beyond beauty and presence. The daughter would grow remembering that both mattered. That survival required bread and water and shelter, but that life required something else as well. Some attention paid to what existed beyond immediate need. "Thank you for the bread," I said. She nodded, turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. "She asks about death too," the neighbor said quietly, "since her grandfather passed last winter." I waited. Let the silence hold space for whatever needed speaking. I told her that Nix's children include Thanatos. That death comes from the same mother as sleep. That they are brothers rather than enemies. She looked at me directly then, searching my face for confirmation or correction. Was that right to say? The question carried weight. She was not asking about theological precision, about whether priests would approve or temples endorse. She asked whether the answer served her daughter, whether it helped or harmed. Nix bore many children, I said, Thanatos among them. Also Hypnos, who brings sleep, and the Moirai, who measure and cut the thread. I paused, chose the next words carefully. Death is not punishment, not something imposed by angry gods. It arrives because we are mortal, because the thread has length but not infinity. The neighbor absorbed this, turned it over in her mind the way hands turn good cloth, testing weight and texture. "That helps," she said finally. "Makes it less frightening somehow, to think of death as family to sleep, as natural rather than cruel." She left then, walked back toward her own house where daughter and duties waited, where the daily tasks continued regardless of what questions arose in young minds or what answers mothers assembled from fragments and faith and whatever wisdom they could gather. I closed the door, carried the basket to the table, broke one loaf in half. The interior remained soft. The crust crackled under pressure. Simple bread, basic sustenance, but given freely, offered without ceremony. I ate slowly. Let the grain settle. Let warmth spread from stomach outward. The neighbor had learned from the old woman without perhaps realizing the lesson. Had absorbed something about giving without expectation, about recognizing need before it became crisis, about moving through the world with attention paid to others' circumstances. Now she taught her daughter to count stars, to see death as natural rather than monstrous, to understand that darkness was not enemy but condition, regular as breath, reliable as stone. The child would grow with these understandings, would pass them forward or let them fade depending on what life taught and what she chose to remember. But the connection remained, old woman to mother to daughter. Knowledge transferred not through ritual or institution, but through ordinary moments, through bread given and questions answered, through evenings spent counting stars together. That was how Nyx's truth survived. Not in temples or scripture, not in priests' proclamations or formal doctrine, but in mothers telling daughters that night always leaves, in neighbors sharing food, in attention paid to what endured beneath everything else. I wrapped the remaining bread, set it carefully on the shelf near the stone. 2 objects now, both gifts, both carrying more than their physical substance. The stone held age, held witness to time before memory, before temples, before gods claimed dominion over what existed before they rose to power. The bread held community, held the simple knowledge that people needed each other. That isolation served no one, that even solitary witnesses required connection to continue witnessing. Outside, the village moved through morning's obligations. Market would open soon. Voices would rise in greeting and negotiation. Children would play between houses. The daily commerce of living would continue in all its mundane necessity. I would join them eventually. Carry water from the well. Perhaps trade what little I possessed for what little I required. Move among neighbors who knew my face if not my thoughts. But first I sat with the bread and the stone, with the gifts given across time, with the understanding that Nyx's lessons appeared not only in darkness, but in how darkness was spoken of, how it was explained to frightened children, how it was honored through ordinary kindness between people who shared space and seasons and the same cycling sky. The fire burned lower. Morning advanced toward midday. Light claimed its temporary dominion with neither triumph nor apology, and I remained witness to what connected across generations, to how understanding passed from hand to hand, from mother to child, from stranger to stranger who became less strange through bread shared and truth offered plainly. That seemed like relationship enough, like the bond that mattered when stripped of decoration and pretense. We were all children of the same darkness, all subjects of the same night, all temporary flames against the same vast void. The bread reminded me that flames burned warmer when gathered together. That witness required community even when performed in solitude. I would remember this, would carry it forward into whatever remained of my measured thread. The neighbor had given more than bread. She had demonstrated what the old woman had understood. That Nyx's greatest gift was not darkness itself, but what darkness taught about how to move through light. I finished the bread, wiped crumbs from my hands into the basket. The fire had settled to coals now, red embers pulsing like slow heartbeats. The room held warmth without the bright dance of flame. Through the small window, morning light fell in clean angles. No drama to it, just illumination doing what illumination does, making edges visible, casting familiar objects into temporary sharpness. I thought about the neighbor's daughter counting stars, creating patterns where none had been named. The old woman would have approved of that, would have understood that naming was its own form of creation. That attention given to darkness made darkness less consuming. The child would grow, would perhaps forget some of what her mother taught, would learn other things, harder things. The world had methods of education that softened nothing for youth or innocence. But something would remain, some fragment of understanding about night's regularity, about how darkness arrived and departed according to patterns older than any god who claimed dominion over them. I rose from the table, carried the basket to the corner where such things were kept, shook out the cloth, folded it carefully, Even borrowed items deserved care, especially those. The stone caught light from the window. Not dramatically. It was not a gem or polished thing, just old rock holding ancient witness. But the angle of sun revealed small veins running through it, tiny rivers of different mineral, evidence of time's slow work shaping what appeared unchanging. The bread beside it would not last, would grow stale within days, would eventually harden or mold. Its nature was temporary. Grain transformed by fire into sustenance. Sustenance transformed by time into decay. Both objects spoke truth. The stone about duration, the bread about transience. We existed between them. Mortal lives measured against geological patience. Brief flames against vast darkness. I had lived long enough now to feel both truths. The weight of years accumulated. The brevity of years remaining. The thread of my life had spun out further than many. Further than the neighbor's father who died last winter. Further than children who never reached their second summer. But it would end. The Moirai did not grant exceptions. The shears cut regardless of who held the thread or what that thread had witnessed. Strange to find comfort in that. In the certainty of ending. But I did find it. Had found it more clearly since the old woman passed. Since I took up this role of witness without fully understanding what the role required. It required seeing, remembering, connecting what appeared separate, understanding that the great goddess Nyx did not demand worship or sacrifice, did not require temples or priests mediating between darkness and those who moved through it. She simply was. Had been before gods organized themselves into hierarchies and domains, would be after they faded or transformed or whatever fate awaited even divine beings when time moved beyond their relevance. That was the knowledge worth preserving, not through institutions that claimed authority, not through rituals that calcified into empty repetition, but through ordinary transmission, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, stranger to stranger, across the simple threshold of shared bread and honest conversation. I moved to the window, looked out at the village. Market had opened now. Voices carried on the warming air, commerce and greeting and negotiation, daily work of living among others. A child ran between houses, chasing something invisible, following the particular logic of young imagination. An older woman carried a basket toward the well, moving slowly. Age in her joints, but moving nonetheless. Continuing the tasks that continued regardless. I recognized both figures, though I could not name them. Faces known from years of proximity, lives lived parallel to mine. Intersecting occasionally, mostly remaining separate. That was how most people moved through the world, in loose proximity rather than tight connection. Sharing space without necessarily sharing understanding. But sometimes the barriers thinned. Sometimes need or circumstance or simple kindness brought people closer, made them less strange to each other, made community something real rather than merely geographic. The old woman had understood that, had moved through the village with attention paid to who struggled, who needed, who remained invisible to others rushing through their own concerns. I tried to do the same, though I lacked her particular gift for knowing exactly when to appear, exactly what to offer. She had possessed timing I could not replicate, but I could witness, could remain available when questions arose, could offer what understanding I had gathered about Nyx and her children and the patterns that governed existence beneath the noise of divine politics. That seemed like enough, like the role I could fill given my limitations, my mortal boundaries. The thread still spinning but growing shorter with each sunrise. The market sounds grew louder, more voices joining, the day claiming its territory. Soon I would need to join them, to move among neighbors, to exist not as witness holding private knowledge, but as person requiring water and food and basic commerce. But not yet. I remained at the window, watching light strengthen, watching shadows shrink back toward the objects that cast them. The ordinary magic of rotation and distance, of celestial bodies following paths established before consciousness arrived to name them. Nyx's children surrounded everything. Hemera brought day. Ether cleared the upper air. The Moirai measured every thread. Thanatos waited patiently for each ending. Hypnos offered nightly respite from awareness. They worked without ceremony, without demanding recognition. They simply performed their functions. Regular as breath, reliable as stone. That was divinity stripped to theater. Power expressed through consistency rather than spectacle. I found more truth in that than in all the temple ceremonies I had witnessed. All the priests claiming to channel divine will. All the sacrifices offered to appease gods whose moods allegedly shifted like weather. Nyx did not shift, did not require appeasement, did not threaten punishment for insufficient worship. She arrived each evening, departed each morning. The rhythm continued whether anyone noticed or not, whether anyone counted stars or explained darkness to frightened children or honored her name. But noticing mattered. Not to Nyx, perhaps, but to those who noticed, to those who found comfort in understanding that darkness was not chaos but pattern, not enemy but necessity, not punishment but condition of existence. The child counting stars learned that, would carry it forward, would perhaps teach her own children someday, or perhaps not. Perhaps she would forget, turn toward other concerns, let the knowledge fade. That was not my decision, not my responsibility. I could only witness, could only preserve what I understood for as long as my thread continued, could only offer answers when questions arrived at my door in the form of neighbors carrying bread. The fire had died to ash now, the room growing cooler. I would need to rebuild it eventually, to maintain warmth against evening's inevitable arrival. But for now I stood at the window, watching the village, feeling the bread settle in my stomach, feeling the weight of the stone's ancient patience radiating from the shelf. Two gifts, two truths, duration and transience, pattern and change. We existed between them, brief and mortal, and ultimately insignificant in the vast measure of time, but connected nonetheless, to each other, to the darkness that gave us rest, to the patterns that gave existence shape and meaning. That seemed like enough, like the understanding worth holding during whatever remained of the day, whatever remained of the thread still spinning toward its measured end. The sound of footsteps approached along the path outside, measured and deliberate. Someone walking with purpose rather than wandering. I turned from the window, recognized the gate before the figure appeared. The weaver who lived 3 houses down. She carried something wrapped in cloth, her shoulders hunched against wind that wasn't particularly strong. She paused at my threshold, knocked twice. The formality of it made me smile slightly. We had known each other for decades. But courtesy persisted. Structure held even where familiarity might have eroded it. I opened the door. She stood there, face weathered like wood left in sun and rain, eyes still sharp despite the years. The bundle in her arms moved slightly, fabric shifting over whatever lay beneath. "I need to ask something," she said. "Not a request for entry. A statement of need." I stepped aside. She entered. Set the bundle carefully on the table beside the bread. The stone remained on its shelf, watching without eyes, witnessing without judgment. She unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing thread, spools of it, different colors, different weights, some fine as spider silk, others thick as rope. "They tangle," she said, "no matter how carefully I arrange them. Every morning I find knots, threads crossed that shouldn't be, patterns disrupted." I looked at the spools. They appeared ordinary enough, wool and linen. plant dyes creating blues and reds and earth tones, nothing supernatural in their composition. You think it means something, I said. Not a question. She nodded. The Moirai. They work with thread. They measure and cut and spin. Maybe this is a sign, a message. I picked up one of the spools, felt the texture. The slight roughness of wool against fingertips, thread made by hands, twisted and prepared for weaving, for creating cloth that would become garments or blankets or wall hangings. Ordinary thread, subject to ordinary tangles. But the Moirai did work with thread. Their thread measured lives rather than cloth. But the symbolism connected. The image resonated. Show me how you store them, I said. She demonstrated. Basket in the corner. Spools arranged by color. Careful organization that should have prevented disorder, should have kept each thread separate from its neighbors. I watched her hands. Still steady despite age. Still capable. Fingers that had woven countless patterns over decades. That understood tension and rhythm, that knew when to pull tight and when to leave slack. The house settles, I said finally. Wood shifts with temperature, with moisture. Small movements we don't notice, but enough to disturb carefully balanced objects. She looked disappointed, perhaps hoping for mystery, for divine intervention explaining mundane frustration. Or, I continued, your cat walks through the basket at night, paws catching threads, creating chaos not from malice but from simple presence moving through space. A smile cracked her weathered face. I don't have a cat. Then the house settles. She wrapped the spools again, slower this time. Considering. You don't think it means anything? I think everything means something, I said. Thread tangles. That's its nature. The Moirai's thread never tangles because they control it absolutely. Mortal thread tangles because we control nothing absolutely. Both truths exist. Both matter. She tied the cloth. Secured the bundle. The old woman would have said something wiser. The old woman would have told you to store the spools upright instead of on their sides. Gravity works differently depending on orientation. That earned a genuine laugh, brief and surprised. She lifted the bundle, headed toward the door. Thank you, she said. For disappointing you? For being honest. She left. Footsteps receding down the path, returning to her house, to her loom, to threads that would tangle again tomorrow, regardless of how carefully she arranged them tonight. I closed the door, returned to the window. The child had disappeared. The older woman had reached the well. Others had joined her there. Voices carried across the distance. Words unclear, but tone suggesting gossip. Information exchanged. Social bonds maintained through casual conversation about nothing particularly important. That was community. Not profound connection, not deep understanding. Just proximity, just regular interaction. Just the accumulation of small moments that added up to familiarity over years. The weaver would tell someone about the tangled thread, about consulting me, about receiving practical rather than mystical answers. The story would travel through the village, modified with each retelling, eventually becoming something different from what actually occurred. That was how knowledge moved. Imperfectly, altered by each person who carried it, changed by interpretation and memory and the desire to make events more interesting than they had been. But the core remained. The weaver had tangles. I had suggested causes. She had left somewhat satisfied. The transaction completed. The need addressed as much as it could be. Simple. Ordinary. Real. I moved to the hearth, knelt carefully. Age making the movement slower than it once had been. Ash still warm beneath its grey surface. Coals dead, but heat lingering in stone. I added kindling. Small sticks arranged to allow airflow, The structure mattered. Combustion required oxygen, required fuel, required the right arrangement of elements, like everything else. Pattern and condition, cause and effect. Laws governing fire the same way laws govern celestial movements, the same way laws governed life and death and the turning of seasons. Not mysterious, not arbitrary, not subject to divine whim, just regular, just consistent, just the way things worked when you paid attention to how things worked. I struck flint against steel, once, twice, sparks falling into tinder, catching, growing, flame appearing from friction and oxygen and material willing to burn. The fire built slowly, smoke rising toward the opening in the roof, heat beginning to push back against the morning chill, warmth returning to the small room. Outside the market sounds continued. Life proceeding, people buying and selling, arguing over prices, commenting on weather, planning meals and work and all the small details that comprised existence. I added larger wood to the fire, watched flames climb, watched light dance against stone walls, shadows moving in rhythm with combustion. Nyx would return tonight, would spread her cloak across the sky, would bring darkness and stars and the quiet that allowed rest. Hemera would retreat. The exchange would occur without negotiation, without conflict, just the regular turn that had occurred since the beginning, since before mortals arrived to witness and name and try to understand. The fire crackled, settled into steady burning. The room warmed. I returned to the window. The day would continue. People would move through their tasks. Night would come. They would sleep. Morning would return. The cycle would repeat, and somewhere in that repetition, meaning accumulated. Not grand meaning, not the kind that changed everything, just the small meaning that came from witnessing, from understanding, from standing at windows and watching light change, from answering questions about tangled thread with honesty rather than mystery, from keeping the stone on the shelf where it could catch sunlight and remind anyone who looked that duration exceeded any single life, from accepting bread from neighbors, from returning borrowed baskets, from existing as part of the loose network that made community real enough to matter. The thread still spun, still measured out whatever remained. But while it continued, this seemed like enough. To witness, to remember, to offer what understanding I held when questions arrived, to tend the fire, to watch the village, to feel morning strengthen into afternoon, to wait for evening, for darkness, for Nyx to return and prove once again that pattern held. That seemed like enough. The afternoon stretched long across the village. Shadows shifted as the sun moved through its arc, changing the shapes of buildings, altering the angles of light that fell through my window. I watched a merchant pack his cart, slow, deliberate movements. Each item placed with care, cloth bundles folded, ceramic vessels wrapped in straw. The cart filling from front to back according to some logic known only to him. His apprentice helped, younger, less methodical, handing items without understanding the order. The merchant redirected him twice. Patient correction. No anger, just guidance offered through demonstration rather than words. That was teaching, not through explanation, but through repetition. Through watching someone who knew the work perform it correctly, through gradually understanding why order mattered, why certain items went beneath others, why weight needed distribution. The cart loaded eventually. The merchant checked the harness, adjusted straps, ran his hand along the horse's neck, speaking quietly. Words I could not hear, but tone suggesting reassurance. The horse shifted, ears flickering, ready but not eager. They departed, cartwheels creaking, hooves striking packed earth in steady rhythm. The sound fading as they moved down the road that led to the next village. to the next market, to the same transactions repeated in different locations. Trade required movement, required carrying goods from places of abundance to places of need, required roads and carts and patient horses and merchants willing to spend days traveling for modest profit. Nothing mystical about it, just economics. Just the practical reality that villages could not produce everything their residents needed. The well emptied. The women dispersed, returning to homes and work. The center of the village grew quieter, not silent, just less crowded. Voices coming from different directions now rather than concentrated in one location. A dog wandered through the square, brown and lean, nose to the ground, searching for dropped food or interesting smells. It paused at the well, lapped at spilled water, continued its circuit. No one claimed it. Or perhaps everyone did. Village dogs belonged to the community rather than individuals. Fed by whoever had scraps, tolerated because they kept rats from grain stores and barked when strangers approached. Useful without being loved, present without being seen. Like many things, the fire behind me settled into coals. Heat steady now, no longer building but maintaining. I turned from the window, added another log. Not too large, just enough to sustain warmth through the coming evening. The bread sat where I had left it. I broke off another piece. Ate slowly, tasting the grain, the salt, the faint sweetness that came from honey mixed into dough. Someone's hands had kneaded this, had shaped it, had placed it in an oven and judged when heat had transformed flour and water into something edible. Every loaf represented knowledge, represented technique passed down through generations, represented the accumulated understanding of how grain and fire and time combined to sustain life. Nothing appeared from nothing. Everything carried history. I returned the remaining bread to its cloth, brushed crumbs from my hands. They fell to the floor, would be swept later. Or not. Small disorder that mattered little in the broader scheme. The stone still caught light from the window, afternoon sun striking it at a different angle now. The surface gleamed, smooth from handling, from existing through time while hands that had once touched it turned to dust. Permanence was relative. The stone would outlast me, would outlast the village probably. But even stone wore down eventually. Even mountains became sand given enough wind and rain and centuries. Nothing lasted forever. But some things lasted long enough that the difference became academic for mortal purposes. I sat on the bench near the hearth, let the warmth reach my back. Let my eyes rest on the fire rather than the window. Flames moved in patterns. Never exactly the same, but always following similar forms. Rising, curling, consuming fuel, converting solid matter into heat and light and ash. Transformation was constant. Everything always becoming something else. Wood becoming smoke. Day becoming night. Youth becoming age. The process was neither good nor bad, just inevitable. Outside, someone called to someone else. A greeting. A question about borrowed tools. An answer shouted back. A conversation brief. Practical. Ending when the information exchanged. That was most talking. Not profound, not memorable. Just communication serving immediate needs. Coordinating activity. Maintaining social connection through acknowledgement. Words did not need to be significant to serve purpose. I thought about Nyx, about the cloak spreading across the sky in a few hours, about stars appearing, about mortals lighting lamps and closing doors and settling into sleep. She never changed the pattern, never delayed darkness because someone wanted more daylight, never hurried night because someone craved rest. She simply arrived when the turn required her arrival, departed when Hemira's time began. Reliable. consistent, indifferent to preference or prayer. That was what made her different from the Olympians. They responded to worship, to sacrifice, to flattery and fear. They altered plans based on mood, based on grudges, based on which mortal had caught their attention. Nyx just was. Just performed her function, just turned the wheel that moved the cosmos through its cycle. I respected that, had always respected that. The unwavering nature. The refusal to be anything other than what she was meant to be. The fire popped, a pocket of moisture in the wood expanding and bursting. Sparks rising briefly, dying before they reached the roof opening. Temporary brightness, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Most things were temporary. Most moments passed without leaving trace. Most days blended into others until separating one from another became impossible. But the accumulation mattered. The sum of temporary moments became a life, became memory, became the weight of experience that shaped how one understood new events. I had accumulated much, had witnessed much, had stood at this window or others like it and watched light change for more years than most mortals received. That was not virtue, not accomplishment, just duration, just continuing to breathe while others stopped. But duration brought understanding, brought pattern recognition, brought the ability to see present events in context of past repetitions. The weaver's thread would tangle again. The merchant would make another journey. The dog would search the square tomorrow. Children would play, wells would be visited. Bread would be baked, and Nyx would spread her cloak. And I would watch. That seemed not just enough, but appropriate. Fitting. The correct occupation for someone whose thread still spun, but whose active participation had ended. To remember. To exist at the edge where observation met understanding. To tend the fire. To accept the bread. To answer questions honestly when they arrived. To wait for darkness. To trust the pattern. To find meaning in repetition rather than seeking significance in novelty. The room grew warmer. My back absorbed heat from the hearth. My eyes grew heavy watching flames. Outside the afternoon eased toward evening. Shadows lengthened. The air shifted. That change mortals felt but could not name. That threshold between day's brightness and night's approach. Soon now. Soon Hemera would fade. Soon the sky would darken. Soon stars would emerge like seeds scattered across dark soil, and Nyx would return, bringing closure to another turn. I did not need to watch for her. She would arrive regardless, but I would watch anyway, because that was what I did, what I had always done. Witness to the eternal rhythm, keeper of no great wisdom, just an old voice in a stone house remembering when chaos birthed the first powers, when night and day were born, when the pattern began that still continued. The fire burned steady. The village prepared for evening. The thread spun on. And that was enough. The sun touched the western hills. Light changed quality, became softer, more amber, the kind of illumination that made stone walls glow as if remembering warmth from earlier hours. I stood, moved toward the window again, my legs stiff from sitting but willing enough once they remembered their purpose. The square had emptied further. Only a few figures remained. A woman carrying an amphora balanced on her hip, a child running ahead of her mother. The dog had found a new spot near the well where someone had dropped something earlier. Scraps, perhaps. Or nothing at all. Just a place that smelled interesting enough to investigate. The merchant's cart was gone now, completely out of sight. Already climbing the road that led toward the next village. The horse would be tired by the time they stopped for the night. The man would build a small fire, eat traveling food. Sleep under his cart or in some farmer's barn if he'd arranged it beforehand. Then tomorrow he would arrive somewhere else. Would spread his goods, would conduct the same negotiations, would leave again. The pattern was reliable, like Nyx herself, like all things that operated according to their nature rather than according to wish or whim. I looked at the sky, still bright but changing. God. The blue deepening toward something richer, something that would eventually become the canvas for stars. Hemera was preparing her departure, not that she made preparations in any conscious sense. She simply receded, allowed her opposite to approach, gave way because that was the agreement older than agreements, older than words, older than anything except the first stirring in chaos itself. I had seen her many times. Hemera, not clearly, not distinctly, but sensed. The way one senses warmth without seeing fire, the way one knows morning has arrived before opening eyes. She had always seemed gentler than her mother, less absolute. Daylight could be soft or harsh, could be filtered through clouds or burning directly overhead. But night was only ever night, complete, all-enveloping. Nyx did not compromise, did not adjust her nature to suit mortal preference. She arrived in fullness or not at all. The woman with the amphora disappeared down a side street. The child followed reluctantly, called back twice before obeying. Their voices faded quickly, absorbed by distance and the evening air. Silence settled over the square, not complete silence. Never that. Always small sounds. Always movement somewhere. But the diminished quiet that came when most people had retreated indoors. When doors were closed and meals prepared and families gathered around their own hearths. I returned to the bench. Added wood to the fire. Not much. Just enough to keep it alive through the next few hours. The flames accepted the fuel gratefully. Rose slightly. Sent new light across the room. The stone object on the table caught that light. Glowed for a moment. Then settled back into ordinary appearance. Everything glowed briefly before fading. Everything had its moment of brightness before returning to whatever it had been before. The bread still sat wrapped in its cloth. I could eat more if I wanted. Probably should. But appetite was a diminished thing these days. Food served function more than pleasure. Kept the body operating, kept the thread spinning. Nothing more. I thought about the stories I'd witnessed. The tales that had unfolded across decades. Across centuries if one was being precise about measurement. Nyx had been there for all of it. Every triumph. Every tragedy. Every birth and death. Every moment of joy and despair. She had spread her cloak over them equally. Had given darkness to heroes and cowards alike. Had provided night for lovers' meetings and assassins' work. Had covered everything without judgment or preference. That was her gift, perhaps. Not just darkness. Not just stars. But impartiality. The guarantee that night would come regardless of how the day had gone. That rest would arrive whether it had been earned or not. That sleep would offer itself to all who closed their eyes and accepted its approach. Mortals feared the dark sometimes, built fires to push it back, told stories about monsters that emerged when light failed, created rituals to protect against dangers they imagined lurking beyond the fire's reach. But Nyx was not the danger. She was the container. The space in which things happened. The canvas. Not the painting. Monsters existed in daylight too. Probably more reliably. But blame always fell on darkness because darkness revealed what daylight hid. Revealed vulnerability. Revealed helplessness. Revealed the truth that vision was limited and understanding incomplete. The sky outside had deepened considerably. The amber light was fading, being replaced by something closer to violet. The threshold moment was approaching, that instant when day became night, when one sister departed and the other arrived. No fanfare marked the transition. No trumpet call, no announcement, Just gradual change, light diminishing, darkness growing, the slow, inevitable shift that happened every evening and would happen every evening until the cosmos itself unwound. I watched the window, watched the color change, watched the first star appear. Not a star, probably. A planet. Or Jupiter? Something bright enough to show before full dark arrived. But it looked like a star. Served the same purpose. Marked the beginning of night's dominion. More would follow. Dozens. Hundreds. Thousands. The whole scattered multitude that Nyx carried with her. Some said the stars were burning. Others said they were holes in the fabric of night through which celestial fire showed. Others said they were the eyes of gods watching the world below. I had no opinion about what they were, only knew they appeared when darkness arrived. Knew they formed patterns mortals had named, knew they guided travelers and marked seasons and served purposes both practical and poetic. The room had grown dim. The fire provided most of the light now. Outside was transitioning into that brief period when neither day nor night held dominance, the between time. The threshold. Nyx would arrive fully soon, would spread her cloak completely, would transform the visible world into something simplified, something reduced to shapes and shadows, something that forced mortals to rely on memory and trust rather than sight. What strikes me most about this story is how it mirrors our own struggles, the choices we make, the loves we risk, the moments that define us. Perhaps that's why these ancient tales endure, because they speak to something fundamental about existence, about the rhythm of light and dark, about the necessity of rest, about the beauty found in reliable patterns that repeat themselves regardless of how much changes around them. The gods on Olympus might scheme and quarrel, might involve themselves in mortal affairs for good or ill, might demand worship and sacrifice and elaborate rituals, but Nyx required nothing, asked for nothing, simply performed her function, simply brought night when night was needed, simply continued the pattern that had begun before Olympus existed and would continue after it fell. That was perhaps the greatest power, not the ability to change things, but the willingness to maintain constancy, to be what one was meant to be, to accept one's purpose and fulfill it without complaint or deviation. The fire burned lower. The room settled into evening's quiet. Outside, the darkness completed its arrival. Nyx had come once more, as she always came, as she always would, and I sat in my stone house watching the window become a rectangle of dark, watching the pattern continue, watching the threads spin on. The village slept. The stars emerged. The night deepened, and that, as it had always been, was enough. For listeners finding rest in this journey through ancient stories, may you return to Olympus dreams whenever peace is needed. Until then, may the night bring you gentle rest, and may the patterns that sustain the ancients sustain you still.